aggregation. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. It's Leslie John, who is Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Negotiations, Organizations, and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School. She teaches the negotiations course to MBAs, as well as the MBA curriculum and various executive ed courses. She's taught the core marketing course for the MBA required curriculum. Her research centers around the seemingly paradoxical and sometimes self-destructive decisions that people make, especially as they pertain to two critically important domains, online consumer privacy and health. To explore these topics, she uses laboratory and field-based methods in a complementary and iterative fashion. Field experiments, in collaboration with companies, document important real-world phenomena, and lab experiments nail down the psychological processes underlying these phenomena. Her work has been published in journals such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Psychological Science, Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of the American Medical Association. She's also received media attention from the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine. Professor John holds a PhD in behavioral decision research from Carnegie Mellon University, where she also earned her master's in psych and behavioral decision research and completed her bachelor's in psych at the University of Waterloo. With that, I'll turn it over to Leslie.
Hi there. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks everyone for coming to listen to this talk. I've tried to make it a kind of a happy medium. I understand there's some nerdly academics. That's redundant. All academics are nerdy. There's academics and there's also practitioners on this call. So I've tried to kind of have a happy medium with respect to going into the real details of experiments, which I'm not going to do a ton of, while also keeping the application to practice close at heart. Okay, so in this project, we're interested in how people react when firms are more transparent about the ways they collect and use consumers' personal information. I think this topic is more relevant now than maybe ever before. And I'm going to talk about this specific research project, but let me first motivate the kind of bigger picture topic. The research I'm going to talk about today is just one project in an area of research where I try to understand a number of things. For one, I try to understand when and why people are concerned about their privacy, when and why they're okay and not okay with firms, say, monitoring them, tracking them, eliciting their personal data, and so on. Similarly, I also try to understand when and why people are willing to share or not willing to share their personal information. So I try to answer questions like, why are people so willing to share their personal information on ambiguous quiz websites, like those are on Facebook, as we know, but then at other times we express grave concerns about our privacy? Why the disconnect? Another question I try to study is why do they post salacious photos, offensive comments on social media, despite the fact that their damage to their relationships, reputations, even careers can be permanent? So I think that these phenomena really relate to an emerging area of investigation, which is what I focus on, and that's the psychology of privacy. And I think this issue is really central to understanding human behavior in a variety of different contexts, including consumer-firm interactions, which we're going to focus on today, but also other contexts like job interviews, social media, romantic relationships, and beyond. And I'm interested in these questions because I think that the Internet has really created a truly fundamental shift towards openness. We know it's given firms many, many new ways to collect information on people, to aggregate it. And in marketing, we know that it's enabled marketers to use consumers' information and provide ever more customized offerings. And the results, in some ways, have been very impressive, right? So research, as we know, it's shown that digital targeting meaningfully improves the response to advertisements. And on the flip side, advertisement performance declines when marketers' access to consumers' data is restricted. So lots and lots of new opportunities, including lots of new opportunities for marketers because of the new availability of personal information. But it's also, as we know, created privacy perils for consumers. And the media highlights these perils regularly. So here's just one example. So there's the fact that even though disclosing online, disclosing on Facebook, disclosing on social media, even though it feels fleeting, the Internet is actually a very permanent form of disclosure, and this can really come back to bite people, right? So here's just one of the many, many, many possible examples I could show you. But there's cases of people who have been fired based on what they posted on Facebook. So, for example, this person was, shall I say, venting about her boss on Facebook. I also think it's interesting the choice of what to black out here. I just pulled this from the Internet, and there's other offensive words in this, and I don't know why it makes me wonder that the thing that's blacked out must be like way worse. At any rate, the point here is that this person is saying offensive things about her employer on her Facebook account, and kind of forgets that that she posted this. And later, her boss finds it, sees it, so she forgets that her boss is one of her friends, Facebook friends, so to speak. Her boss sees this and proceeds to fire her over what she posted on Facebook. So the big picture point is, of course, that the things we post can really get us into trouble on Facebook and beyond, and more broadly, the new availability of information and the abilities to share information with others introduces new privacy perils. Another privacy peril is that of data aggregation based on small pieces of information. So this is simply, before I show the example on data aggregation, this is just driving home the point more broadly that people look to your social media presence to make hiring decisions based on what you post, and they don't usually adjust their opinions of you upward based on what they see. They're only less impressed typically based on what they find about you on social media. But the other privacy peril example I wanted to give you is this example about data aggregation. So it's possible, as we know, to aggregate disparate pieces of information on a person, and you can actually form new information on them. For example, there's some really fascinating, groundbreaking research showing that based on two pieces of information that people typically post on their Facebook accounts, their date of birth and their place of birth, you can predict, often with very high accuracy, with up to something like 90% accuracy, you can predict people's social security number, again, just based on their place of birth and their date of birth. And that's, of course, because social security numbers are not generated randomly. Rather, they are generated, there's a pattern based on your place of birth and your date of birth. And what these researchers did was they were able to detect this pattern by mining death records where when people die, their social security numbers and this information becomes public. So they kind of figured out what the algorithm was, and then they were able to show that you can actually predict people's numbers based on this information. So I bet most people, when they put their name, their date of birth and place of birth on Facebook, they're not thinking, oh, someone could actually potentially, if they're savvy, make a pretty good guess as to what my social security number is. More relevant to the project I'll tell you about today, which pertains to behaviorally targeted advertising, there's the case, of course, the infamous case of Target, which sent tailored coupons to women that it inferred to be pregnant. Well, this didn't go over so well when one of those promotions fell in the hands of a father whose teenage daughter was pregnant, which until that point was unbeknownst to him. So this set off a wave of controversy. Now, as I mentioned, behaviorally targeted ads improve ad performance. They improve ad effectiveness. Now, the research supporting ad personalization, however, has tended to study consumers who were largely unaware that their data dictated which ads they saw. But today, such naivete is increasingly rare. So for example, now on, this is just this picture of Kayak as an example of how there have been some self-regulatory attempts, industry self-regulatory attempts to be more disclosive about the reason why you're seeing the ads you see. So if you look at the tiny little icon in the top right corner of this Kayak ad, this here is when you click on that, we're all familiar with these blue little triangle things, and to be very technical about it. And so when you click on it, you can, of course, get some information on why you're seeing the ad, and you can also, in this case, get some information on how to opt out of different types of ads you get. So what we're going to do is talk about some of the work we've been doing to try to understand how consumers respond to ad transparency. So how consumers respond to finding out the reasons why they see the ads they see. Facebook, for its part, a few years ago, instated a policy where you can find out why you're seeing the ads you see. So on Facebook, although it is hidden behind several different menus, but basically when you click on an ad, you can then click on some menus to find out why you're seeing the ad, and it will tell you things like, in this case, the advertiser wants to reach people who have a certain interest, say, in televisions, and it tells you it's based on things you do on Facebook, based on things you've liked, and there's tons and tons of different types of messages that you can get on Facebook. This is just one example. And so what we're interested in is how learning of this information, learning of why you're seeing the ad you see, how that affects ad effectiveness. And there's a variety of different possibilities, right? We weren't sure, which is why we did the research. On the one hand, we thought that this knowledge could actually increase ad effectiveness. Why? Well, after all, it's a salient reminder that this is a product that the firm thinks is well suited to you, right? So it's reminding you that, hey, this is really personalized for you, so it emphasizes the consumer product fit. So from that perspective, it might increase ad effectiveness. It may also, in a way, communicate to the consumer that the firm is exerting effort to generate the ad. And we know that when firms, all else equal, when firms show effort, that consumers like this, and it can cause them to be more interested in purchasing from that firm. So one of my favorite examples in that respect is some work by my HBS colleagues Ryan Buell and Mike Norton on operational transparency. So by that they mean when firms show the work they do for consumers to provide a given product or service. So for example, a sort of canonical example is Kayak. Of course, that's the airline search engine. So I would say the defining kind of unique feature of Kayak is when it's searching for a certain fare for you, it tells you the different airlines it's searching through ostensibly as it's generating the different quotes, right? And so the idea is that by showing you the work that it's doing, it makes you appreciate the recommendations more, and it makes you more willing to buy. That's kind of what this research on operational transparency has found. Others have found similar effects, that showing effort is desirable. However, on the other hand, making salient the practices that underlie behavioral targeting, it has an important additional consideration, we thought, and that's the capacity to rouse privacy concerns. We thought that ad transparency, so telling people why they're seeing the ads they see, how their data has been used to generate the ads, we thought that it kind of highlights to consumers that their personal data are potentially being used outside their control, outside their explicit consent. And so we thought this might bring privacy concerns to the fore, in which case it might make consumers less willing to interact with a given advertisement. And in fact, this is consistent with some research in this area showing, for example, that when people are concerned about their privacy, they become less willing to make purchases. They're less willing to open commercial emails. They're more willing to divulge personal information. When they're concerned about the privacy, they're less willing to divulge personal information. And so depending on the specific practices illuminated by ad transparency, we thought it could actually make consumers left feeling intruded upon. And so this idea, or this logic, coupled with the fact that consumers, they really have idiosyncratic kind of preconceived notions of how firms ought to handle their personal data, this suggests that consumers' responses to ad transparency, they might actually depend on the perceived intrusiveness of the practices that are used to generate the ads, emphasis being on perceived intrusiveness. It's really in the eyes of the consumer what counts as intrusive. And so we thought that when ad transparency reveals a practice deemed to be an intrusion in the eyes of consumers, that it would backfire. But the question is, what do people deem intrusive? Like, what are the facets that make something intrusive? Well, one is, of course, fairly straightforward. That's the nature of the information. So basically common sense holds that the more intimate the personal information involved in generating the ad, the less comfortable people will be with others knowing it. So data on sex, health, finances, those are topic areas that we know are especially sensitive. But a second, we thought, more nuanced factor, less obvious factor, we thought might involve the way in which consumers' personal information changes hands, what we're referring to as information flows. So what do I mean by this? Well, in the offline world, people have really strong norms about what is versus is not an acceptable information flow or way of having their information change hands. And we think that these norms, people use these norms, apply these norms in the online space as well to judge whether a given ad in a given way of using their information in generating the ad, whether that's invasive, taboo, or whether it's okay. So one of these norms in the offline world is, to be colloquial about it, is don't talk behind people's backs, right? So people may be comfortable disclosing personal information directly to someone, so first-person sharing. They often become uneasy when that information is passed along without their knowledge, so third-party sharing. So put differently, suppose I disclose something sensitive about myself to Sally. Well, I'd be upset if Sally then tells our mutual friend Brenda that if she tells that information to Brenda, even though I'd be completely comfortable with Brenda knowing it if I had been the one to tell her directly, right? So this idea that people talking behind our backs is aversive to us. And a second one, again to be a little colloquial, might be something like, don't judge a book by its cover. So that might be, don't make statements about someone and their personality just by some superficial or limited piece of information about them. And that may translate into, in an online context, it may translate into something like making inferences about people. These are kind of just some high-level ideas on these information flows, which I will then test in the research that I'll present as to whether those help to explain when and why ad transparency backfires versus boosts effectiveness. Okay, so with that, I'm going to show you research that speaks to, first, this question of whether these norms apply in the digital advertising space. Secondly, we're going to look at whether when consumers realize that these norms have been violated, ad effectiveness decreases. And finally, we're going to look at a potential upside, which is that when consumers realize that these norms that they have about how their information ought to be used, that these norms have been honored, we think that ad transparency might be enhanced, especially in contexts where you kind of already have consumers' trust, so they essentially are poised to believe the things you tell them about how you're using their information. We thought that in that situation, ad effectiveness might be enhanced relative to not giving people information on why they're seeing the ads they see. And then why is there this company logo, Merits Motivation Solutions in the bottom right? That's because this third piece that I'll get to, that was a set of field experiments that we did with our field research partner, Merit's Motivation Solutions, and I'll get to that in the final portion of this talk, what we did with them. Okay, so for the first question here, looking at whether people take their cues from the offline world and apply them in the online world to understand or to kind of make judgments of whether the way an advertiser is using their information is appropriate or inappropriate. To do that, what we did was we basically just asked people. So we asked people what was acceptable versus not acceptable. What we did was we compiled a list of different advertising practices that we got off of Facebook and Google, like actual ways that they use consumers' information. And so we culled those practices, and then we asked people, we asked them, so we explained essentially what behaviorally targeted ads are, and we then showed people each practice, and we asked them to rate how acceptable or unacceptable they thought each practice was. And then what we did, so we then ran a factor analysis. So lots of you probably already know what this is and have done it yourself, but it's basically a statistical analysis which tells us the patterns that emerge, so the clusters of practices that people rate similarly in acceptability or unacceptability. And when we did that factor analysis, a few different factors emerged. So for example, these types of items like these, so practices such as when an advertiser uses my past purchase history on another company's website, or my browsing history on another company's website, you can see the theme here. These types of items were viewed as similar in degree of acceptability, similarly unacceptable. And we called these, there's kind of what's the commonality of them, it's that they all refer to third-party sharing, so talking behind your back. On the other hand, these types of items, they were also rated similarly. They were rated similarly relatively acceptable, and this we refer to as first-person sharing. So here the advertiser is using information that the consumer kind of overtly disclosed to that advertiser, as opposed to that advertiser finding information from third-party sources to generate the ads. And then we also found this other factor which pertains to whether information was inferred or stated by the consumer. So these items here are inferences. They were all rated similar in unacceptability. And then the other side of this factor is, of course, stated, so things that the consumer overtly tells the marketer versus, and one thing that sometimes trips people up is the difference between first-person sharing and stated. So the emphasis in the stated is the consumer overtly shares it with the marketer. In first-person sharing, the emphasis is on it streaming from consumer to marketer, as opposed to streaming from the marketer to marketer to consumer. So the marketer, being in the third-party sharing, is getting the information behind the customer's back. So then what we did is we looked at whether these norms apply in the digital space, and I think it'll become even more clear, if it's not already, how this might play out in ad transparency, like what kind of a message might denote to people that third-party sharing is occurring versus first-person sharing, and so on. So I'll be showing you the exact stimuli we use, so that's clear how we operationalize it, what it kind of means in a realistic context. Okay. So the next question, moving forward to do that, I'm going to show you some research on how when consumers realize that these norms have been violated, ad effectiveness decreases. That's the next item on our agenda here. And so the way we investigated, so first we're going to look at, I'm going to show you two kind of sets of experiments. One that looks at awareness of third-party sharing, and the other that looks at awareness that an inference is being made. Those are two things that people find kind of off-putting. And we're going to see whether when people become aware of those things, it decreases ad effectiveness. So the way we investigated both of these, the next two studies, they're going to be through controlled lab experiments. So the first being this testing of awareness of third-party sharing. Both of these experiments, so their controlled nature, of course, helps us get at causality. And to do this, we actually simulate targeted advertising. So all participants are seeing the same advertisement, and what we do is we essentially vary what we tell them about how that ad was generated. And then we measure their reaction. We measure how interested they are in buying the thing that's being advertised. The downside, of course, is that they're simulated. So in the final part of this talk, I'll show you I'll show you how some of these dynamics play out in a real shopping platform. So this is where we partnered with Perils to do some field experiments to see whether when on a real shopping platform, when the platform reveals why you're seeing an ad, that it may actually increase ad effectiveness. So we'll get to that at the end. But for now, we're gonna stick to these very controlled experiments. And here's what we did in this first study, the study to look at the effect of awareness of third-party sharing on purchase interest. So what we did was we asked people to browse a movie website, and we listed movies, and we asked them to click on the movies that they might be interested in. So as if they're trying to decide which movie to go to, click on movies to figure out which movie you might want to go to. And sure enough, when they clicked on a movie, a description of it appeared. And we then presented them with an advertisement that had ostensibly been targeted based on their browsing behavior. Now the twist was that for some of the people, we set it up so that the ad was shown on a different website, so a site external to the site on which they'd browsed the movies. So we simulated third-party sharing. And for other people, we set it up so that the ad was shown within the site on which they had browsed movies. So this would be like first-person sharing. And when we showed people the ad, we varied what we told them about why they were seeing the ad. So there were three different versions. So here's the ad. This is the control or the baseline condition where we gave people no information on why they're seeing that ad. In this condition, the first-party sharing condition, we told people, so this is the example of kind of what the ad transparency looks like, what first-person sharing ad transparency looks like. They were told, you're seeing this ad based on the products you clicked on while browsing our website. So within our website while you browse the movies, that's why you're seeing this ad. Or in the third-party sharing condition, people were told that they're seeing this ad based on behavior on a third-party website, so outside of this platform. And then what we did was we measured primarily the primary DV, the primary outcome measure was purchase interest. And I'm going to show you the mean purchase interest. It was a 1 to 7 scale. And what we found was the lowest purchase interest was in the third-party sharing. So when people were aware that third-party sharing had occurred, purchase interest was significantly lower than both the baseline, so it was in this case 27% lower than baseline, and it was 21% lower than the first-person sharing condition. Now, the point estimates, the kind of 21%, 27% decrease, this is not to say that whenever this is implemented, this is the kind of a size of the relative effect you should see. The key thing is that kind of the directional effects, right? That overall, the third-party sharing decreased ad effectiveness relative to the other types of, whether it's relative to being aware that first-party sharing has occurred or relative to being left completely in the dark about how your information was used. Okay, now we have a kind of sister study that looks at highlighting to consumers that an inference has been made about them. That's another thing that people find off-putting. And so for this study, what we did was we got people to fill out a survey. It wasn't this particular survey. This is just an example. But we basically got them to answer some questions about themselves to make a kind of a consumer profile of themselves. So everybody answered some questions, and then everybody was presented with an ad. And again, just like the previous experiment, we varied what we told them about why they were seeing the ad. So we had a baseline condition in which they were simply left in the dark about why they were seeing the ad. In the next condition, the stated information, they were told that they were seeing this ad based on the information that you stated in your profile. And then finally, in the icky condition, for lack of a better way of saying it, people were told that they were seeing this ad based on stuff that the marketer had inferred about them. And so here, in line with our predictions, what we found, so we measured purchase interest, and we found that, again, this uncomfortable kind of use of one's information, making an inference, decreased purchase interest relative to the other two conditions. So in this case, becoming aware that an inference has been made decreased your purchase interest by about 19% relative to being aware that the ad was generated based on something you directly stated, versus and lowered it by 15% relative to being left completely in the dark. And in both of these studies, the baseline and the middle condition, the kind of desirable form, they don't typically differ. Okay, so in sum, so far, the check mark is here is not to say that this is what we should be doing necessarily. It's not saying that we should be using consumers' information in ways they don't want. What it's, of course, denoting is that we have some evidence here suggesting that when consumers realize that their information has been flowing in ways that they find uncomfortable or unacceptable, their stated purchase interest decreases. But what we were next interested in is the possible upside. So we were interested in whether testing whether honoring these norms and telling consumers that you're honoring them, whether it might actually increase ad effectiveness. And we thought that one context where this might be the case is a context where consumers already trust you. So it's only potentially when consumers trust you that they'll really find your statements, that you're honoring their expectations, to be credible, to be compelling. And one context where consumer trust is high, typically high, is of course loyalty programs, right? Members of loyalty programs trust that brand more than those who aren't members. So to test this question of whether in this context, revealing that consumers' norms about how their information ought to flow are being honored, whether this increases ad effectiveness, we turn to a field partner. This is the Merits Motivation Solutions. And so Merits is specifically with Charlotte Blank, who's their Chief Behavioral Officer and HBS alum. Had to give, of course, the shout out there. So what we did was we turned to this field partner, and so Merits is a company that has lots of different branches, including it runs a white label online platform for companies that operate rewards programs. So for example, if a consumer is enrolled in a hotel membership program, Marriott, Hilton, and accumulates points for that program, or airlines, like any loyalty point redemption site, you know how you can use those points to buy different items on the reward redemption site. And so those sites, many of them are serviced by Merits. So the sites are really similar in look and feel to popular e-commerce sites like Amazon, really down to the advertisements and product recommendations they give, which is what we leveraged, except of course the currency is points instead of money typically. And so what we did was we we used this platform and we ran an A/B test with the product recommendation pane. So this on the right, this is a screenshot. The whole thing is a screenshot of this point redemption site of one particular product view. And on the right, you can see a recommended bar, and that essentially is a targeted advertisement. So those are truly targeted based on information they have on the given user. And what we did was we did a little tweak to this recommendation pane. So what you're seeing right now is the baseline or control condition. But what we did, the other half of users were exposed to a tiny tweak here where you can see it here. It says recommended based on your clicks on our site. So this, of course, is telling people that first-party sharing is occurring, that the ad is based on stuff you've done within the site. And so we thought this may actually increase the people's propensity to, say, click on the thing being recommended. And so what we did was we measured, half of people saw the top, and the other half saw the bottom one, and the ads were always targeted for them. And we measured the click-through rate. So the click-through rate is, of course, the most kind of proximal measure to the manipulation in question here. And what we found was that the telling people that the ad is based on their behavior within the site the click-through rate was 10% compared to 9%, so a 1 percentage point difference, which is a relative difference of 11%, but a 1 percentage point difference is, of course, nothing to scoff at when you're looking at click-through rates. And we measured other more downstream measures as well, so like the amount of time people spend on the product view after clicking on it. We measured conversions in the end, and all of those variables, the kind of more downstream variables, they also go in the same direction. They're not always significant, but they're always in that direction where the revealing that the desirable information flow has occurred. In this case, first-person sharing, it increases these metrics. So it increases. It's not always significant, but in this case, actually, it did result in more money spent on the recommended products. As I said, it's always in that direction. It's not always significant. I don't want to oversell and say this will always lead to more conversions. Okay, so then what we did is in the next study, we had a sister study here where we looked at revealing the other type of desirable use of information. So this is the baseline. And this is the experimental condition coming up for the sister experiment. So this is, of course, based on telling people that an ad was generated based on stuff they've stated as opposed to inferred. So we, of course, don't test in these experiments the uncomfortable kind. We only test the good kind. This is recommended based on what you've shared with us. That's designed to be indicative of telling people that the ad was generated based on stuff they've stated to the marketer. And we expected that to produce a higher click-through rate, and in fact it did. So the click-through rate here, actually there's a bigger difference here. So the fact that the difference here between the bottom experimental condition and the baseline, the fact that it's so much bigger than in the previous experiment, I wouldn't take that to conclude that, it's that revealing, that information, that an ad was generated based on stated information is like much more effective than revealing it's based on first-person information sharing. I wouldn't conclude that. It's that we tested these experiments were tested kind of in isolation from each other using different clients. So I would not attribute it necessarily the difference in effectiveness between the two types of between the two experiments to the nature of what is being disclosed. Again, the key takeaway here is that in both experiments, both this experiment and the previous experiment, revealing that an ad was based on an information flow that people find acceptable, it increased the click-through rate. In this case, it increased the click-through rate by a whopping 50%. That was the relative difference. Okay, so zooming out, I'd like to open it up a little more broadly before we conclude with, I think, a few minutes for questions. I want to just zoom out and offer some practical, big picture practical implications of this work. And then I'll kind of offer some comments on the potential upside of transparency. So the first thing I'd say is stay away from sensitive information whenever possible. So we didn't spend a lot of time focusing on the nature of the information used to generate an ad because I think it's pretty straightforward. But when possible, try to avoid using sensitive information to target ads like health conditions, sexual orientation, and so on. So for example, Google doesn't allow advertisers to target on the basis of sexual interest or categories like personal hardships. And Facebook has been following or trying to follow suit with its policies. And you can, if you're advertising something that is inherently sensitive, you can consider trying to find your customers in ways that don't involve using their personal information, like advertising on websites that those customers are likely to visit, for example. Secondly is, a second suggestion is to commit to at least a minimum amount of transparency. So there's really a wide spectrum between concealment on the one hand and full disclosure on the other end. There's many, many acceptable points between the two. As a general rule of thumb, I'd suggest that marketers might be willing to provide information about data use practices at least upon request. I think these disclosures should be clear and easily accessible as opposed to buried behind menus. And finally, of course, to use data judiciously when possible. So data collection, we know, opens up all sorts of innovative and clever insights into consumers. But again, I counsel restraint here because we know that consumers react poorly when personal information is used to generate a recommendation or an ad that feels intrusive or inappropriate. But on the flip side of that, I think that people will give advertisers more leeway if they're really delighted with the recommendations they get. So just a couple examples here. Stitch Fix, the subscription service clothing retailer that we have in the U.S., Stitch Fix knows a lot about its customers, including information that people really typically like or try to keep private, like their weight, their bra size. But we know that, of course, this information is extremely useful to what the site's service is, and that's creating, or the company's service, that's creating a curated package of clothing pieces that really are fit and tailored to the consumer, delivered to that consumer's doorstep. And so because, in this case, Stitch Fix's use of personal information, it seems appropriate, seems helpful, I think it is less likely to feel invasive. And there may even be cases where consumers are willing to forgive these unacceptable data collection practices if they benefit from it in a really compelling way. So one example here might be dating apps, which some of them actually tell a user how many Facebook, like they connect with Facebook, third party, and they tell a user how many Facebook friends he or she has in common with a given dating prospect. So it makes it clear that third-party sharing is occurring, which we know from this research often results in backlash. But in this case, the sharing is potentially really valued by the users to vet people. So in that case, there may not be this backlash. This is, of course, an open question for future research potentially. Okay, so in conclusion, when it comes to ad personalization, I think there's really a fine line between creepy and delightful. And so on the one hand, it could be tempting to conclude that the best approach, or maybe the safest approach, is to keep people in the dark. So to obscure the fact that personal information is being used to target consumers, especially when advertising products of a more sensitive nature. And that's actually, that's indeed what Target reportedly tried after its pregnancy promotion scandal. Remember the example I gave at the beginning of this webinar? So apparently, a New York Times article describes this, apparently Target started arbitrarily inserting coupons for random items in its mailings to expecting mothers so that the baby product ads, like the truly targeted ads, they would look incidental and less conspicuous. Now, this is like, I got to hand it to them, it's super clever, but it also seems potentially a little underhanded, right? And such tactics, they may be super effective in the short run, but they might also be ultimately misguided. So to summarize what the conclusions of this paper and talk are and are not, the bottom line is not don't ever use third-party sharing, don't ever make inferences, and I think that would be kind of a naive conclusion. These are, after all, really powerful marketing tools, and they can create value for both firms and consumers. The takeaway is also not to simply keep these practices opaque. Rather, the takeaway, I think, is to, one, be cognizant that these techniques can understandably make consumers uncomfortable. So it's important to make sure that when they're engaged in, you have the trust of consumers and that you're using their consumers' information judiciously as opposed to gratuitously, and to really keep the value being delivered to consumers at heart. And finally, As a general rule of thumb, I would say that if one needs to hide and be opaque about one's practices in order to kind of make them fly so that they kind of fly under the radar, if that's the only way they'll work, it's of course not a great sign. So one thought is to ask oneself the simple question when thinking about what practices to use and not use: does this practice pass the sunlight test? So it's probably an increasingly untenable position to hold on to think that some of these practices can be kept secret. If we just look, for example, what's been happening with Facebook these days, when people are essentially becoming more aware of all the ways Facebook has been using their information, people are upset about it, needless to say. Okay, well, I think that I will leave it at that. And if you're interested in further reading, we have an HBR piece about this project, and we also have the primary research associated, like the Nerdly Journal article, is a Journal of Consumer Research article that I can send you upon request if you email me. All right, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Leslie, and we do have some time for a few questions. Let me remind people, if you do have more questions, send them directly through the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. And a few things that have come in already, let me just pose them to you. One is a reference to a study done a few years ago that showed that behavioral targeting provided lift at the bottom of the funnel, but not at the top, where the more committed people are and the more committed make more purchases, and therefore would be more likely to respond to a personalized ad. The question is, were you able to look at the depth in the sales funnel for your research to get at how consumers feel about having their data used differently based on their commitment to a potential purchase?
Yeah,
Not a long question.
That's a good question. I've not looked at that, and this is where I wish we were all in the same room, because then I would chat with this person about what their intuitions and experiences are. In a way, you could think of it as potentially the more committed a consumer is, so the further down they are in the sales funnel, the more potentially comfortable they are with the marketer, the more they may be buying into the value proposition, and so the more comfortable they may be in having their information used. That would be the prediction I would have in that case, but I think it would be really interesting to look at how the effect of transparency may depend on where a consumer is in the funnel. It's a good question.
And yeah, you can, the person asking the question can connect with you through your email address, and we can try to help facilitate that too if you want to have follow-up discussions.
I see another question here that says, are there any efforts to use portable neuro recordings while the participants perform their answering? So I think this person is wondering whether there's any neuroscientific research on this particular topic. There is none that I'm aware of. I do always, this is another thing where I would ask the respondent kind of what in particular they're interested in. I think neuroscientific research, like neuromarketing, can be very informative, but in some ways, like the good version of it is, but sometimes the kind of devil's advocate I sometimes ask of neuromarketing research is, like, some of it has the flavor of the following, where you'll see a behavioral difference as a function of some independent variable, and then you stick them in a scanner that's being a little bit, flippant about it, but you scan them, and then you show that different areas of the brain are highlighted or are active. And so the kind of devil's advocate approach I think of is like, well, if there's a behavioral difference, and if as marketers we're really concerned about people's behavior, then it would be surprising if different brain regions weren't activated, right? Now that's the kind of skeptical pushback, but it can be very helpful, for example, if you want to elucidate more about a process underlying an effect. The other thing I would say the non-snarky version answer to your question is it prompts me to think of some really fascinating, actually the only neuroscientific or neuropsychology, neuromarketing research I know of that looks at in this broad area of disclosure. It's a piece of research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so super fancy academic journal, by Diana Tammer. She's at Princeton. She's a psychologist, and they did this really interesting study where they scanned people's brains as people answered sensitive questions or revelatory questions, and they basically showed that there is an intrinsic reward, so the reward system in the brain is activated when people get to disclose information about themselves. So behaviorally, this meant that people actually were willing to pay to answer questions about themselves as opposed to questions that weren't about themselves. And in the brain, you could see that the reward center, like answering questions about yourself, was associated with the pleasure or reward centers of the brain, which I think is like extremely interesting research, especially when you think of there's one world where of people studying disclosure, and then there's another world of people people studying privacy, when and why people are concerned about their privacy. I kind of work in both worlds, and in the world of privacy, we tend to think of information as something that people are not willing to give up, that's costly for people to give up because it violates your privacy in a way. But then the disclosure world, this piece of evidence I just mentioned points to the opposite, right? That like disclosure is something that information is something people want to give up. So there's, I think, really two fundamentally different human motivations going on. And so now I'm rambling, but needless to say, I find this topic very interesting. Can I repeat the academic? Yes. So her first name is Diana, and her last name is Tammer. That's Tamir, and she's at Princeton.
Great. So another question that came in was, considering the privacy issues with ad transparency and the critical need for trust to facilitate purchase interest, should marketers focus more attention on existing customers to generate additional sales over lead generation with potential new customers? So retention versus acquisition.
Yeah, so I think that this research doesn't speak to whether retention versus acquisition is more important. I mean, they're both, as we know, they're both phenomenally important to the health of the firm. So I think that maybe the more relevant question would be do the effects differ depending on whether the customer base is like already has a relationship with the firm or not. And for that, I would suggest that the kind of upside of ad transparency is more likely to surface among consumers, among your existing base, because they already know you and trust you, right? That's kind of what the last study pointed to. But I also think, so trust is something that is really central to topics of privacy, topics of disclosure. And I guess before we end, I can just briefly tell you about one project that is in the works with us right now. We haven't published it yet, but we're working hard on a paper with Ryan Buell, my colleague here, and Bhavya Mohan, who's a former doctoral student who's amazing. And what we've been finding is an upside to disclosing information that firms typically keep private, that is information on the cost structure to provide, like a company sells a wallet, how much does the leather cost the company to provide? So essentially divulging information relevant to margins. We have been finding that when firms do this, and we find it in field experiments with actual e-tailers and in lab experiments, when firms do this, it increases consumers' trust in that firm, just like when a person discloses something kind of intimate to you. Disclosing cost structure is kind of intimate for firms to disclose. People trust that person, that firm more, and in this case, it translates into increased sales. That's what our field experiments have been showing. Now, it's not to say, firms should always disclose this information. There very good reasons to keep it private sometimes. For example, oftentimes cost structure is a source of competitive advantage, but we're showing that under some situations, disclosing cost information can actually increase trust and turn into increased sales. So that's something that I'm kind of excited about right now, and that hopefully will be coming out someday if and when we get it accepted at a journal.
Great. One other question there, maybe you can comment on this one, Leslie. Question is about the implications of programmatic advertising and Amazon ads. Any thoughts on how those phenomenon, particularly like programmatic advertising, is affecting this, or privacy concerns might play out differently depending on the furtherance of that trend toward programmatic?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I wouldn't even want to venture a hypothesis at this point. I think that this is a very new area, and I guess what I will say is that this space more generally is kind of a constantly evolving space, and I think it speaks to the importance of really doing rigorous research and keeping up with what's going on in the marketplace to really understand consumers' behavior and to make better recommendations that are mutually beneficial to firms and consumers alike.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up with your statement about the need for research, and in particular, rather than just focusing on if it's creepy or delightful, actually digging in and trying to figure out what's going on. So we really appreciate that, and thanks very much for making the presentation, Leslie. And just by way of wrap up here, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar soon, and if you do have additional questions, you can follow up with Leslie directly at ljohn@hbs.edu. And if you'd like to receive a related MSI report authored by leading academics, please provide your email